They laughed at her. A room full of powerful men, billionaires, hands that had once ordered the annihilation of entire people. And they all laughed. But none of them knew that the girl standing there, hands trembling, eyes downcast, holding back tears, was the very thing the most dangerous man in the room had been searching for 21 years. Follow this story to the end, and hit like, then comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has traveled in the world. The Blackwood Grand had a smell that Serena Vale had learned to hate. Old money and fresh cruelty, layered under expensive cologne and the kind of perfume that cost more than her monthly rent. She had been working the hotel for 8 months, and in that time she had memorized the exact weight of a loaded silver tray, the angle at which a champagne flute would tip if she wasn't careful, and the particular way that wealthy people looked through her rather than at her, like she was furniture, like she was part of the architecture. Tonight was worse than most. The Harrington Gala was the kind of event that required every available body on staff, which meant Serena had clocked in at 3 in the afternoon and was already 4 hours deep into what would likely be a 12-hour shift. Her feet ached inside her regulation flats. The hem of her uniform pulled across her left shoulder where she'd repaired a seam 3 times with different colored thread because she couldn't afford a replacement. She kept her back straight anyway. Her mother had taught her that. Keep your spine like a rod, Serena. Doesn't matter who's looking. You carry yourself like you matter because you do. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. The ballroom was a cathedral built for the worship of excess. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks from 30-foot ceilings, throwing fractured light across 800 people who had paid $10,000 a plate to be seen in the same room as each other. Politicians stood near the bar performing graciousness for journalists. Hedge fund managers compared watches with the subtle aggression of men who had never learned to fight with their fists. A senator laughed too loudly at something no one found funny. In the far corner, flanked by 2 men who wore their suits the way soldiers wear armor, sat Dominic Castellano. Serena didn't know his name then. She only knew that the corner table had requested the Barolo, not the Bordeaux, and that the man sitting at its center had not touched his glass in 40 minutes. She navigated the room with practiced invisibility, threading between bodies with the tray balanced at shoulder height, her eyes tracking the floor, the elbows, the sudden turns that guests made without warning, because people like them had never had to be careful about the space they occupied. She was 12 feet from the bar when it happened. The woman appeared from the left, blonde, mid-40s, wearing something red and architectural that had been designed by someone with a philosophy rather than a needle. She was turned toward a companion, gesturing broadly, the champagne flute in her hand tracing an arc that Serena saw 2 seconds before the collision and could not prevent. The tray caught the flute. The flute hit the woman's wrist. The wine went sideways, not onto the floor, not onto Serena, but in a long, generous splash directly across the front of the red dress. A dress that, Serena would later learn, had been borrowed from a designer showroom and was currently valued at $43,000. The sound the woman made was not a gasp. It was a note, high and deliberate, like a conductor striking a baton. The ballroom didn't freeze all at once. It happened in ripples. The nearest guest turned first, then the next ring out, then the far tables as the murmur spread. By the time Serena had lowered the tray and opened her mouth to apologize, she had an audience of 300 people. The woman, whose name was Claudette Harrington, who was the host's wife and who had a particular talent for public fury, looked at Serena the way a surgeon looks at an instrument that has failed mid-operation. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't—" "Sorry." Claudette repeated the word like she was tasting something spoiled. She looked around at the nearest guests, inviting them into the performance. "She's sorry." The laughter started small. A snort from somewhere to Serena's right. A murmured exchange. Then a man in a blue tuxedo. 30s, jaw like a movie poster, the particular confidence of someone whose parents had never said no, pulled out his phone and angled the camera. "Get a little closer," he said to no one in particular, grinning. Serena felt the heat rise in her face. She kept her jaw locked. She would not cry. She had made that deal with herself a long time ago. Not in public, never in public, and especially not in front of people who would use it as proof of something. "You'll be paying for this," Claudette said. "Every cent." Claudette. The host, Edward Harrington, materialized from somewhere behind his wife. He was a man who had built a real estate empire on the philosophy that problems should be removed before they became photographs. He looked at Serena with the flat assessment of someone calculating disposal costs. Security. More laughter now. Someone at a nearby table was already repeating the story to a companion who hadn't seen it, their voice carrying the particular delight of witnessed humiliation. Another phone appeared. Then another. Serena set the tray down on the nearest surface because her hands were shaking and she didn't trust herself to keep holding it. She kept her face as still as she could manage. She was thinking about her rent. She was thinking about the letter from the collection agency sitting unopened on her kitchen counter. She was thinking about the fact that her mother's hospital bills had taken everything and she had rebuilt from nothing, and this job was one of 3, and she could not afford to lose it. Not this one. Not right now. Not one more word! The voice came from the far corner of the room, and it was not loud. That was the thing about it that Serena would remember later. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the particular weight of a voice that had never once had to raise itself to be heard, because the people it spoke to understood on a cellular level that they should be listening. Every sound in the room stopped. Not gradually this time. All at once. Serena looked toward the voice and saw the man from the corner table standing. Dominic Castellano was 53 years old and built like someone had assembled him specifically to take up space in a way that made other people feel smaller. He was not a large man by raw measurement, perhaps 6'1", broad through the shoulders in a way that his dark suit acknowledged without advertising. His hair was silver at the temples and black everywhere else, cut close, and his face was the kind of face that had been made interesting by time and by whatever time had required of him. He was not handsome in any simple way. He was something more complicated than that. He was looking at Serena, not at Claudette, not at Edward, not at the phone still hovering in the air. At Serena, with an expression that she could not read and that made something in her chest pull in a direction she didn't understand. Claudette recovered first because women like Claudette had a talent for recovery. Mr. Castellano, this is a private matter. I said not one more word. He wasn't looking at Claudette when he said it. He was already moving. The crowd parted. It was not a subtle thing. It was the movement of water pulling back from something heavy, the instinctive recalculation that happens when everybody in a room simultaneously understands that the geometry has changed. The man in the blue tuxedo lowered his phone. The senator near the bar stopped mid-sentence. Even the bartenders went still. Dominic walked across the ballroom floor toward Serena at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. It was the pace of someone who had never once in his adult life been rushed by external circumstance. Serena didn't move. She didn't know what to do. Her mind was running through scenarios and none of them made sense. She had never seen this man before. She had no reason to know his name or understand why the room was behaving the way the room was behaving. She only knew that the crowd was afraid of him, and that he was walking toward her, and that her heart was doing something irrational. He stopped 2 feet from her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were dark. Darker than she'd expected, nearly black, with the focused quality of a man who is rarely looking at one thing while thinking about another. He was looking at her face. Not the way the guests had been looking at her, not with contempt or amusement or the clinical disinterest of the wealthy, but with something she couldn't name, something that had an edge of something older. He didn't speak to her immediately. He turned to the room first. This woman is a guest of mine. His voice was measured, even. Anyone who speaks to her with anything less than respect answers to me, directly. Claudette Harrington's face had gone the color of old chalk. She's staff, Mr. Castellano. She works here. She ruined my... Edward. Dominic looked at the host. Not a long look. Just enough. Handle this. Edward Harrington put his hand on his wife's arm before she could speak again, and the particular pressure of that grip communicated the entire calculation in a single gesture. Claudette went silent. The man in the blue tuxedo had his phone in his pocket now. The laughter was gone. The room had reconfigured itself around a new understanding, and everyone present was in the process of very quietly updating their behavior. Dominic looked back at Serena. Are you hurt? He asked. She blinked. What? Are you hurt? No, I'm not hurt. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm fine. He nodded once, Then he said almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, "Come with me." "I'm working." Something moved across his face. Not irritation, something else. "I know. Come with me anyway." Serena should have said no. She understood that on some rational level. She was a maid at a hotel, and this was a gala, and she had tray assignments and a supervisor who had already been looking for reasons to document her performance. There was nothing logical about following a stranger away from her shift, but the room was still watching. And whatever this man had done, whatever he had stopped something. He had put his body and his name between her and the room's appetite for her humiliation, and she didn't understand why, and that not understanding was a splinter in the back of her mind that she couldn't leave alone. She followed him. He led her not to a table, but toward the east corridor, the one that connected the ballroom to the private function rooms. One of his men, the taller of the two who had flanked him, fell into step 5 paces behind without being asked. The others stayed in the ballroom. The corridor was quieter. The noise of the gala became muffled, then distant. Dominic stopped near a window that looked out onto the hotel's rear courtyard, where the catering trucks were still running and the night kitchen staff moved between loading docks in clouds of breath and steam. He turned to face her. "I need to tell you something," he said. Serena crossed her arms. It was a defensive gesture, and she didn't try to hide it. "You don't know me." "No, I don't." He paused. There was a quality to his stillness that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. It was simply absolute, like a man who had made a practice of inhabiting his own patience. "But I've been looking for you for a long time." The skin on her arms went cold. "That doesn't make any sense," she said. "No, it doesn't yet." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, thick paper, multiple pages. He held it out to her. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something that might be a threat before you look at it the way you look at something you might want. Then she took it. The first page had a letterhead she didn't recognize. Some kind of private investigation firm. The address somewhere in lower Manhattan. Below the letterhead, columns of data. She didn't understand most of it at first. Reference numbers, processing dates, sample identifiers. But then she hit the third page and the language simplified itself into something blunt and scientific and completely, catastrophically clear. Probability of biological relationship, 99.9998%. Paternal sample, Dominic A. Castellano. Subject sample, Serena M. Vale. The document fell out of focus. She read it again, and again. She turned back to the first page and then to the third, and then she made herself stand very still because the corridor seemed to be doing something structural. "This is fake," she said. "It's not. This kind of thing, people do this kind of thing. Scams. There are people who target—" She stopped. Her voice had developed a tremor she didn't want. "I don't have money. I'm a maid. What would you even—" "I'm not after anything from you." He said it with a flatness that was harder to dismiss than reassurance would have been. Reassurance could be manufactured. Flatness had to come from somewhere real. "My daughter was taken from the hospital 21 years ago, 3 days old. Her mother didn't survive the year. I spent the next 2 decades trying to find out what happened." He paused. 6 weeks ago, the investigator found a match in a private database. Cross-referenced 3 separate sources. The results came back this morning. Serena was thinking about her mother, not the DNA report's subject, her actual mother, Carol Vale, who had worked double shifts at a textile factory in Queens and who had smelled like industrial detergent and who had held Serena's face in her hands during every crisis of her childhood and said, "You came from somewhere good, baby. You came from somewhere good." Carol Vale had died of a cardiac event 4 years ago. Bam. She had not, in her final weeks, which Serena had spent almost entirely at her bedside, ever said a word about where Serena had actually come from. "She's dead," Serena said. "The woman who raised you?" "My mother. Yes." The word came out with a weight she hadn't intended. "She never—" She stopped again, pressed her palm flat against the wall behind her. The plaster was cold. She needed something cold. "She never told me." Dominic said nothing for a moment. "She might not have known the full truth," he said finally. "These things, the people who arranged it, they had ways of making the chain untraceable. She might have believed what she was told." What was she told? I don't know yet. That's still part of the investigation. Serena looked at him, really looked at him. Not the way she had in the ballroom, processing him as a threat variable, but with the specific focus of someone trying to find something familiar in a stranger's face. She didn't know what she was looking for. A jawline. A particular way the eyes sat. The way his hands rested at his sides. She didn't know what she found either. She didn't trust herself to know. Who took me? She asked. Something shifted in his face. It was not a large shift, but it was there. A man named Julian Mercer, he said. And in the ballroom, 200 feet away, Julian Mercer, who had spent the last 3 hours at a table near the eastern wall, and who had watched through narrowed eyes as Dominic Castellano walked a hotel maid out of the room with a document in his hand, reached for his phone with fingers that had gone ice cold and typed a single line to a number that existed in no contact list. He found her. Get ready. Serena didn't know about the message. She didn't know about the 4 men who had arrived with catering credentials that afternoon and who were currently positioned at 3 exits and 1 service corridor, waiting for an instruction that had just been sent. She didn't know that the investigation that had found her had also, in finding her, lit a fuse in a man who had spent 21 years making sure the truth of what he'd done stayed buried. She only knew that the man standing before her was looking at her with something in his eyes that she didn't have a word for, and that the document in her hand said she was someone else's daughter, and that somewhere in the architecture of that fact, her entire understanding of her own history was beginning to come apart at the seams. I need... She stopped, pressed her teeth together, started again. I need to think about this. I know. This isn't... You can't just walk someone across a room and hand them a piece of paper and... Her voice broke. Just for a second. She locked it back down. 22 years. You understand that? 22 years. Yes. You don't get to just... She couldn't finish the sentence. There wasn't a finish that didn't sound like something a child would say, and she was not a child, and she refused to be one in front of this man. I don't know you. No, he said. You don't. A long silence. I'm not going to accept this tonight. I can't. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but different, like something that had been held at a distance for a very long time was being moved, carefully, a single inch closer. I'm asking you not to disappear, he said. Not tonight. I spent 21 years looking. I'd like to know where you are. Serena was still staring at the 3rd page of the document. At the number, 99.9998%, that had the particular cruelty of statistics that were not actually statistics. That were, in the language of science, as close to certainty as science would permit itself to be. She was about to answer when the far end of the corridor exploded into movement. The service door at the east end slammed open so hard it hit the wall and left a dent. 3 men came through it in tactical order. Not hotel staff, not guests, not anyone who belonged in this corridor. They wore catering uniforms and moved with the specific economy of people who had rehearsed this. Dominic's second moved before Serena could process what was happening. He was simply there, and then he was in front of her, and his jacket had shifted in a way that meant something, and his hand was already at his side, and his voice, low, controlled, aimed at Dominic, said one word. Mercer. Dominic's face changed, not with fear. Fear wasn't the right word for what moved through it. It was something colder and more total, like a system switching states. He grabbed Serena's arm, not rough, but absolute, and said, Stay close. The corridor between them and the men was 12 feet of Italian marble. At the far end, the service door was still swinging. Serena Vale, who had gone to work that morning thinking about her rent, who had carried a tray of Barolo to the wrong table and been laughed at by 800 people, and then handed a document that had rearranged the fundamental architecture of who she was. Serena Vale looked at the men at the end of the corridor and understood, for the first time in her life, that whoever she had been before tonight no longer existed, and that whoever she was going to be was going to have to figure itself out very fast. The first man through the service door was already at 9 feet when Dominic's guard, whose name Serena did not know and would not learn until much later, made his move. It was not elegant. Nothing about the next 4 seconds was elegant. The guard stepped left, used the corridor wall as leverage, and drove his shoulder into the lead man's sternum with the kind of impact that produced a sound like a sandbag dropped from height. They went down together, hitting the marble floor in a tangle of limbs and displaced catering uniform, and the noise of it echoed off the high ceiling in a way that made Serena's back teeth ache. The second man was reaching inside his jacket. Dominic moved Serena backward by her arm, not throwing her, not dragging her, but with the specific directional force of someone who had made a calculation and was executing it. And she went because her body understood the geometry even when her mind was still 3 seconds behind. Her shoulder hit the wall. The document was still in her hand. She was aware of that in a disconnected way, like a person in a car accident who notices their coffee cup is still upright. "Door," Dominic said. "Which? Behind you. Go." She went. The door he meant was a utility access door, gray metal, the kind of door that existed in the infrastructure of large buildings and was never meant to be noticed. It opened onto a narrow stairwell that smelled like cleaning solution and old concrete. Emergency lighting, amber and thin. Serena went through first because Dominic's hand was at her back and the sounds in the corridor behind her were getting louder, and she was operating on something below conscious thought now. Something older. Something that understood the sound of violence and knew how to run from it. Dominic came through and pulled the door shut behind him. They stood at the top of a stairwell. 5 flights down, a green exit sign threw shadows upward. "Move," he said. They moved. Serena had worked enough doubles in this hotel to know the building's skeleton in a way the guests never did. She knew that this stairwell exited on the 2nd floor into the linen corridor, and from there you could reach the service elevator bank. And from the service elevator bank, there was a loading dock access that the catering trucks used. She was running the route in her head while her feet were already taking the stairs 2 at a time. The document folded and jammed into the front pocket of her uniform apron because she would not leave it. She did not know why she would not leave it. She only knew she wouldn't. 2 flights down, Dominic said, "You know this building?" "I work here." "Which way out avoids the east loading dock?" She looked at him. He was keeping pace behind her without any visible effort, which registered somewhere in the back of her mind as a piece of information about him. "West Service exit, ground floor, past the laundry room. Take us there." "There's going to be staff, I know. People will see." "Serena." He said her name with a flatness that was not unkind but that closed the conversation. "Take us there." She took them there. The 2nd floor linen corridor was empty. The laundry room had 2 workers, both of whom looked up when Serena pushed through the door, and both of whom looked past her at Dominic and then looked back down at their work with the practiced incuriosity of people who understood that certain things were better not witnessed. Serena thought about saying something to them and then didn't. There wasn't anything to say. The West Service exit opened onto an alley that ran between the Blackwood Grand and the office building next to it. Cold air, the smell of the city, exhaust and rain-damp concrete, and something frying somewhere a block north. A black SUV was idling 20 feet from the door, engine running, and before Serena could think to ask how it was already there, the rear door opened and a man she hadn't seen before said, "Get in." She stopped. "I don't get in cars with people I don't know." Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, abstractly, in the way you notice small victories when everything else is in free fall. Dominic was at her shoulder. "Marcus has worked for me for 11 years. That doesn't mean anything to me." "No, it doesn't." He paused. "I can't make you get in. But there are 4 men in that building who were sent to make sure you don't leave it. That's your other option." Serena looked at the open car door. She looked at the alley. She looked at the service exit they'd come through, which was still closed but would not stay closed. She got in the car. Dominic got in after her. Marcus pulled out of the alley before the door was fully shut, and the Blackwood Grand disappeared behind them in the window, its lights still blazing, the gala still going on inside its walls. A different world. The world of 20 minutes ago, which felt now like something she'd read about rather than lived. The interior of the SUV was dark and quiet. Leather seats, the the slight vibration of a well-maintained engine. Dominic sat with 3 inches of space between them and looked straight ahead and said nothing. Serena pulled the document out of her apron pocket. It was crumpled now at one corner from being folded fast. She smoothed it against her knee. The amber glow of a passing streetlight moved across the pages as they drove, and she read the 3rd page again, and then the 4th, which she hadn't reached before. The 4th page was a summary, written in the clipped language of someone who had written many such summaries. A narrative of the investigation, dates and methods, the cross-referencing of 3 databases, the acquisition of the paternal sample, the acquisition of the subject sample. Subject sample acquisition date, November 14th. Location, Blackwood Grand Hotel, New York. She stopped. "My coffee cup," she said. He looked at her then. "From the staff break room, November 14th. Someone took my coffee cup." She remembered it clearly because she'd been annoyed. It was her own mug, not a hotel mug, a ceramic one with a chip in the handle that her mother had bought from a thrift store in Astoria. She'd come back from a shift to find it gone and assumed someone had thrown it out by mistake. "That was you. That was my investigator. You took my DNA without asking me." "Yes." "Without my consent." "Yes." He held her eyes. "I needed to know. I understand if that—" "Don't." She looked back at the document. "Don't explain it. Not right now." She felt the car turn north and then east, and she watched the city outside the window without really seeing it. The thing that was happening in her chest was not a feeling she had a name for. It was not grief exactly, and it was not shock exactly, and it was not anger exactly, though it had qualities of all 3. It was more like the sensation of a floor giving way, not the falling, but the specific moment before the falling, when you've put your weight on something and can feel it starting to go, and you haven't yet lost your balance, but you know you're about to. Her mother had a sister, an aunt in Pittsburgh who sent Christmas cards with $20 folded inside until Serena was 17 and then stopped. Serena had called her when Carol died. The aunt had come to the funeral, stayed one night, and driven back to Pittsburgh the next morning. They hadn't spoken since. She wondered now what the aunt knew. She wondered what anyone knew. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Midtown. I have a residence there. You'll be safe." "I didn't ask if I'd be safe. I asked where we're going." He accepted that distinction. "The Caldwell Building, 42nd floor." Serena had cleaned hotel rooms for 3 years and waited tables for 2 years before that, and worked a register at a pharmacy the year before that. She had never been to the 42nd floor of anything. "I have work tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. I'll have someone contact the hotel." "I'll contact the hotel." "Fine. And I want to be able to leave, whenever I decide I want to leave." "Yes. I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not agreeing to anything. I'm not agreeing that this is real or that you're— I'm just going somewhere safe for tonight because the alternative is going back to my apartment in Queens, and apparently there are people who just tried to grab me out of a hotel corridor, so—" "I understand. Do you?" He looked at her again. In the intermittent light of passing street lamps, his face did the thing it had done in the corridor. Showed her something old and complicated in the vicinity of his eyes, something that he was clearly not accustomed to showing anyone. "More than you know," he said. They didn't speak again until the car stopped. The Caldwell Building had a private entrance at its rear that bypassed the lobby entirely, an elevator that required a key. Serena stood in it and watched the floor numbers climb and thought about the document in her apron pocket, and about Julian Mercer, whose name she now knew, and about the 4 men in catering uniforms, and about the way the room had gone silent when Dominic stood up. The 42nd floor was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. A penthouse from a film, maybe, all glass and white marble and the performative emptiness of extreme wealth. Instead, it was a large apartment with books on real shelves and furniture that had been used, scarred wooden floors, a kitchen where someone had actually been cooking recently because the smell of it still sat in the air. Garlic and something braised, a single light on over the counter. A man was sitting at the kitchen table. He stood when they came in. Late 40s, built compact, with a face that had been broken at least once across the nose and had healed at a slight angle. He was looking at Serena with an expression that was not quite surprised, but more like the expression of someone who has been told a thing and is now seeing the proof of it and finding that proof more concrete than they'd prepared for. "This is Nico," Dominic said. "He runs my operations." "Operations," Serena repeated. "Yes." Nico said nothing. He was still looking at her, and there was something in that look that Serena filed away without unpacking. A quality of assessment, not hostile, but not warm either. The look of someone who had learned to take the measure of people quickly and who was currently taking hers. "Sit down," Dominic said. Not to Serena, to Nico. Nico sat. Dominic moved to the counter and poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of Serena and one in front of the empty chair. He didn't sit. He stood at the edge of the kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Nico. "4 men," he said. "Mercers." "I know," Gallo called. Nico's voice was flat, the vowels carrying a trace of something regional that Serena couldn't place. "He's handling the 2 who are still mobile. The other 2 are—" He glanced at Serena. "Contained." "And Mercer?" "Still at the gala." Nico paused. "For now." Dominic nodded once. Something passed between the 2 men that Serena could read the shape of, but not the content. A long familiarity, the communication of people who had been through enough together that most of a conversation could happen in the space between words. "Why would Julian Mercer want to grab me?" Serena asked. Both men looked at her. "Because the investigation that found you," Dominic said, "also found him." "Found him doing what?" Another pause. This one had a different quality, longer, the quality of someone deciding how much to give. "The kidnapping wasn't random," Dominic said. 21 years ago, someone paid to have you taken, paid to have you placed with a family far from New York, far from anything that connected you to me. The purpose was to—" He stopped, chose the next word carefully. "Leverage. Against me. A daughter I didn't know I had could be used. A daughter I was publicly searching for was a liability." Serena stared at him. "Leverage for what?" "Territory. I was consolidating something at the time. There were people who didn't want that to happen, and who were willing to go further than most would go." He paused again. Mercer brokered the arrangement. He was 29 years old, running errands for a man named DeSanto, who's been dead for 14 years. But Mercer isn't dead. And if my investigators' files get to the right federal desk, which they will, Mercer faces conspiracy charges in a 21-year-old kidnapping case. So he's trying to, what, silence me? You're the living evidence. Without you, the DNA chain breaks. He said it plainly, without apology. With you, there is no case to bury. Serena sat with that. She sat with it for a long moment, looking at the glass of water in front of her, and she thought about what it meant to be 22 years old and working 3 jobs and carrying an unopened collection agency letter on your kitchen counter and then being handed a document that told you your entire history was a crime scene. "Where are the files now?" she asked. "Your investigators' files." "Secure." Meaning they're not in my building and they're not in any of my properties, and the investigator himself is not in the city tonight. "But Mercer knows they exist." "Yes." "So even if something happened to me, the files are still—" "He doesn't know that for certain," Nico said. His voice had an edge to it now. "That's the problem. A man like Mercer, when he's scared, doesn't calculate well. He reacts." "Great," Serena said. "That's great." She stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window, the one that looked north, toward the dark mass of Central Park and the lights of the Upper West Side beyond it, and she pressed her palm flat against the glass. Cold, like the corridor wall. She was apparently doing that now, finding cold surfaces. "I want to talk to the investigator," she said. "That can be arranged." "Not through you. I want a direct number." She heard Dominic behind her, the sound of him crossing the kitchen floor. He stopped somewhere close, not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could hear him breathing. "His name is Carson Weir," Dominic said. "I'll have Marcus get you his direct line tonight. And I want a copy of the full file, not the summary. Everything." "Done." Serena looked at the city, All those lights, all those windows, all those people behind glass living lives that had not, tonight, been informed that they were someone entirely different from who they'd believed. "The woman who raised me," she said. Her voice was very careful. "Carol Vale. Was she involved? In the kidnapping?" Behind her, Dominic was quiet for 3 full seconds. "No," he said. "As far as we can determine, she was told you were a privately arranged adoption. No agency, informal arrangement, which wasn't unusual at the time in certain circles. She paid a sum that was significant for someone of her income. She believed she was doing something legal." Serena closed her eyes. She had needed that. She hadn't known how much she'd needed it until she got it. The understanding that Carol Vale, Carol, who had smelled like industrial detergent and who had held her face in her hands, had not known, had not been a part of it, had only wanted a daughter, had found one in the worst possible way, and had loved her anyway. "Okay," Serena said. She opened her eyes. "Okay." She turned from the window. Nico was watching her with that assessment look. She met it and held it until he glanced away, and she noted the small thing that cost him. "There's a room," Dominic said. "Down the hall. You can—" "I'm not staying." The word landed in the kitchen like a stone. "Serena, I heard you. I heard everything you said. I understand there are men who want to grab me, and I understand the file situation, and I understand—" She pulled the document out of her apron pocket and set it on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with one hand. "I understand what this says, but I'm not staying here tonight. Your apartment isn't safe." "I know." She picked up her bag from where she'd set it near the door. "I have a friend in Brooklyn, 3 locks and a dog and a husband who works nights as a security guard. I'll be fine. I should put someone—" "No." She looked at him directly. "You don't put anyone anywhere near me without my permission. Not from here. That starts now. Understood?" Something in Dominic's face shifted. Again, that complicated thing. He studied her for a moment, and she watched him do it, and she saw the exact moment when he made the calculation and accepted it. "Understood," he said. "I'll call the number Marcus gives me. Tomorrow." She looked at the document one more time. Then she looked at Dominic. I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet. There's a difference." "I know the difference," he said. She left. Marcus drove her to Brooklyn without being asked anything except the address. He didn't speak the entire way, and she was grateful for that, in a way she didn't have words for. She sat in the back of the SUV, with the city moving past the windows, and the document folded in her bag, and her hands loose in her lap, and she thought about nothing. Or tried to. The trying was its own kind of violence. Her friend's name was Diane. Diane opened the door at 11:40 p.m. in pajama pants and a sweatshirt, took one look at Serena's face, said absolutely nothing, and stepped back to let her in. Serena sat on Diane's couch and accepted a cup of tea and said, "Something happened tonight." "Yeah," Diane said, "I can see that." "I don't know where to start." "Start anywhere." Serena started with the spilled wine. She ended with the document. Diane sat through all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things Serena had always valued about her. The patience of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told from the beginning before they could mean anything. When Serena finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. "So the guy is allegedly my biological father?" "Yes." "And he's—" "Yes." "And people tried to—" "Yes." Diane looked at her tea. "Okay," she said. "Okay? I mean, what do you want me to say? It's a lot. But okay." She looked up. "You believe the document?" "I don't know what I believe." "But you took it." "Yes." "And you're going to call the investigator?" "Tomorrow." "And then what?" Serena stared at the steam rising off her mug. She thought about the look on Dominic Castellano's face when she'd walked out of that apartment. Not hurt, not angry, not the look of a man who was used to being refused. Just something quiet and worn and old. The look of someone who had been waiting for a very long time and had learned to keep waiting. "I don't know," she said. She didn't sleep well. The dog, a large, anxious shepherd named Pete, slept at the foot of the pull-out couch, and woke twice to noises from the street, which meant Serena woke twice also, sitting up in the dark apartment with her heart already at a run before she was fully conscious. The second time, she lay awake and looked at the ceiling and listened to the city outside and ran the inventory of what she knew. She was 22. She worked 3 jobs. She had a collection agency letter on her counter. She had a mug with a chipped handle that a man's investigator had taken without asking, and she had never gotten it back. She had a document in her bag that said she was someone else. She had a father, allegedly, who had spent 21 years looking for her and had found her in the worst possible way, and in doing so had lit a fire under a man who had committed a crime 2 decades ago and who was now, somewhere in this city, calculating his options. She had a name, Julian Mercer. At 4 in the morning, she got up and found Diane's laptop on the kitchen table and opened it and typed the name into a search engine. The results loaded. Julian Mercer, 51 years old. Founder and CEO of Mercer Capital Group, a private equity firm with offices in Manhattan and London. Board member at 3 nonprofits, photographed at galas, political fundraisers, charity events. A face that had learned to be publicly smooth, square-jawed, silver-templed, the practiced openness of a man who had made a career out of being trusted. The third search result was from a financial news site dated 6 weeks ago. Mercer Capital Group announces expansion of infrastructure division, strategic partnership with... Serena stopped reading. She went back to the image results. She found a photograph from the Harrington Gala, time-stamped 8:47 p.m., before the wine, before Dominic had stood up, before any of it. The photograph showed the eastern side of the ballroom, several guests visible. In the background, near the east wall, a man at a table. The image was small, taken from across the room, but the face was clear enough. Julian Mercer had been watching her all night, not watching the room, watching her. She stared at the photograph for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and sat in Diane's dark kitchen with her hands flat on the table and understood, with the specific cold clarity that comes only after the adrenaline has fully burned away, that she was not, and probably had not been for a long time, as invisible as she'd believed. Someone had always known exactly where she was, and that someone, right now, was deciding what to do about the fact that Dominic Castellano had found her first. Her phone lit up on the table. An unknown number. A text, just 3 lines. This is Carson Weir. Mr. Castellano gave me your number. There's something in the file I didn't include in the summary. You need to see it before you make any decisions. It changes things. Serena read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time. She looked up at Diane's kitchen window, where the first gray suggestion of morning was beginning to show itself against the dark, and she thought about what kind of thing could be left out of a summary about your own stolen life, and what kind of thing could change what was already, by any rational measure, a situation that had already changed. Serena called Carson Weir back at 5:17 in the morning. He picked up on the 2nd ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. Miss Vale. His voice was a working voice, not warm, not cold, the voice of a man who had made a career out of delivering information and had learned to keep himself out of it. What's in the file? She said. Not a question. A pause. Not long, but waited. I'd prefer to do this in person. It's 5 in the morning. I know what time it is. Then tell me on the phone. Another pause. She heard him breathe out through his nose, the sound of a man deciding. The woman who raised you, Carol Vale. I know who Carol Vale is. Yes, but there's something about how she came to have you that doesn't line up with what Mr. Castellano was told. Another breath. The adoption payment I referenced, the sum she paid, I told him it was consistent with an informal private arrangement. That's accurate. But what I didn't include in the summary is where that money came from. Serena's hand tightened on the phone. Carol Vale worked in a textile factory, Weir continued. Her annual income in the year of your placement was $26,000. The sum she paid for the arrangement was $40,000. She could have saved over how many years? She was 24 when she took you. She had $900 in her checking account the month before the payment cleared. 6 weeks later, she paid $40,000 in cash to an intermediary in Newark. He paused. That money came from somewhere. The kitchen was very quiet. Pete had come padding in from the living room and was sitting near the refrigerator looking at Serena with the benign attentiveness of a dog who understood tone, if not content. "You're saying someone paid her," Serena said. "I'm saying someone gave her the money she used to pay for you. Whether she knew the source, who?" A long pause. The wire transfer, 2 levels back in the intermediary chain, originated from an account belonging to a company called Northgate Consulting, LLC, registered in Delaware, dissolved in 2009. He stopped. Northgate Consulting had one operational client in the relevant period, Julian Mercer. Serena sat very still. "So Mercer," she said slowly, "didn't just arrange the kidnapping. He funded the placement. He paid my mother to take me. He paid an intermediary who paid your mother through a chain that would have been invisible to her. She almost certainly had no idea who was at the other end of it. But yes, the money that bought your life came from Julian Mercer." She looked at the window. The sky outside was shifting, still dark but thinner at the edges, the specific dark of 4:50 a.m. in a city that never entirely slept. "That's what you left out of the summary," she said. "Mr. Castellano doesn't know this yet. I wanted to tell you first because we are started again. Because it's your history, and because what it means for the case against Mercer is significant. It establishes a direct financial link between him and your placement. That's not circumstantial. That's a chain of custody." "Where are you?" "Hoboken. I've been working from a rental since Tuesday. I'll come to you." "Miss Vale, it's not—" "I'll come to you," she said again. "Send me the address." She left Diane's apartment at 6:10 with a note on the kitchen table and Pete watching her go from the couch with the mournful expression of a dog abandoned. The morning was cold and gray, and the subway smelled like the end of someone's long night. She rode it to the PATH station and crossed under the river and came up in Hoboken into a street that was quiet and residential and entirely unlike the Manhattan she'd left, the way places just across water from cities always feel like a different species of place. Weir's rental was a second-floor apartment in a building that had been built in the 70s and not significantly updated since. He buzzed her in without asking who it was, which told her he'd been watching the street. He was smaller in person than his voice suggested. 50s, with the compact economy of a man who had spent a career sitting in cars and waiting, and the particular pallor of someone who had been indoors for several days straight. There were 3 laptops open on the kitchen table, and a printer on the counter with a stack of papers next to it, and a whiteboard against one wall covered in handwriting and red string and printed photographs. Serena stopped when she saw the whiteboard. One of the photographs was of her. It had been taken outside the Blackwood Grand, probably 6 weeks ago, from across the street. She was in her uniform, coming off a shift, head down, bag over one shoulder. She hadn't known she was being photographed. She looked in the photograph exactly the way she had always looked, unremarkable, moving through a city that didn't notice her. "That's unsettling," she said. "I know. I'm sorry." Weir didn't sound particularly sorry, but he sounded like he meant the form of it. "Sit down." She sat. He pulled a manila folder from the stack near the printer and set it in front of her. It was thick, 40, maybe 50 pages. "The full file," he said, as promised. She didn't open it yet. She looked at him. "Tell me the rest." He sat down across from her, and in the particular way of a man who has organized information for a long time, he laid it out for her without preamble or cushioning, the way you lay out a table setting, each piece in its place, each piece necessary. The kidnapping had been arranged by a man named Raymond DeSanto, who had been running the waterfront operations that Dominic Castellano was consolidating in the relevant period. DeSanto had felt the consolidation as an existential threat. His response had been a specific cruelty, not an assassination, which would have created a martyr, but a disappearance. Taking the daughter of a man who didn't yet know he had a daughter and using her as a future bargaining chip. Julian Mercer, at 29, had been DeSanto's legal and financial fixer. He had arranged the operational logistics, found the woman, structured the payments, built the chain. DeSanto was dead. But Mercer had gone on to build a career on the respectability of a man who had never been publicly connected to anything like this. DeSanto died in 2010, Serena said. Cardiac arrest. Yes, So Mercer has been, what? Just walking around? For 14 years since DeSanto died, just living his life? Building his life. Mercer Capital Group has $38 billion in assets under management. He sits on a federal infrastructure advisory panel. He went to a fundraiser at the White House 2 years ago. Weir paused. He's been building the kind of life that makes certain things impossible to believe. Until now. Until the DNA test. Weir folded his hands on the table. Once Castellano finds you and you can testify to the chain, the financial chain, the DNA, the timeline, Mercer's entire construction comes down. He knows that. And you saw last night what he's willing to do when he's scared. Serena opened the folder. She read for 20 minutes in silence. Weir made coffee and set a cup near her elbow and didn't speak. Pete was not here. Diane was not here. There was only the sound of pages turning and the distant noise of Hoboken waking up outside the window and the occasional click of one of Weir's laptops. On page 31, she found something that made her stop. It was a supplementary document, a note that Weir had appended to the main file, flagged with a paperclip. It was a copy of a phone record, a single call, 2 minutes and 40 seconds long, placed on October 3rd of this year, 6 weeks ago, 2 weeks before her mug had been taken. The call was from a number registered to Weir's investigation firm. It had been placed to a cell number that Weir had annotated in the margin in small, careful handwriting. The annotation read, N. Ferrara, Castellano Organization. She looked up. Weir was watching her. He had the expression of a man who had been waiting for her to reach that page. Nico? She said. Yes. Nico knew. She kept her voice very flat. He knew about the investigation before last night. Yes. Before Dominic told me. Mr. Castellano told Nico Ferrara about the investigation results the same evening he received them, before the gala. Weir paused. I placed that call 6 weeks ago because I'd reached a point in the investigation where I needed a secondary confirmation on certain records, and Ferrara had access to documents in the organization's archive that I couldn't get through normal channels. He cooperated. The investigation moved faster because of it. Serena looked back at the phone record. Why is this in the file? Because 3 days after that call, Weir said carefully, someone accessed my firm's external server without authorization. They were looking for the draft summary. They didn't get it. I keep draft files locally, but the attempt was logged. He paused. The access point was an IP address registered to a shared workspace in Lower Manhattan that Mercer Capital Group uses for satellite operations. Serena set the page down. She looked at the wall, at the whiteboard, at the photograph of herself walking out of the Blackwood Grand not knowing she was being photographed. Someone in Dominic's organization told Mercer about the investigation, she said. Weir said nothing. Nico is the only person who knew about it before last night. She heard herself saying the words and they sounded like they were being spoken by someone standing slightly behind her. Nico called Mercer, or someone connected to Mercer, which is how Mercer knew to have men in that building last night, before Dominic even spoke to me publicly. Still Weir said nothing. Does Dominic know this? No. Weir's voice was very even. I found the server access log at 2 this morning. You're the first person I've told. The coffee in front of her was getting cold. She looked at it. She thought about the kitchen in the 42nd floor apartment. She thought about Nico sitting at the table with that assessment look. She thought about the way Dominic had said, Nico has worked for me for 11 years, and the particular inflection of a man who believed it as completely as he believed anything. She thought about what it meant to be betrayed by someone you believed was the architecture of your safety. He's going to destroy Dominic, she said. If Mercer gets the file and Ferrara provides enough internal intelligence to discredit or dismantle the organization's ability to respond, then yes, the federal case falls apart without the DNA chain and without Castellano's cooperation, and Mercer walks. Weir looked at her directly. But that's only part of it. What's the other part? Ferrara knew last night that you'd been found. He knew before Dominic made it public in that ballroom. He knew there were men in the building. Weir was very still. He didn't stop them. The room was very quiet. He was going to let them take me, Serena said. I believe so. Yes. She pushed her chair back and stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below. A man was walking a small dog past a bakery that was just opening, and the ordinary domesticity of it was so far from what was happening inside this apartment that it felt like a different medium, like something broadcast from another signal. Why? She said. Why would Nico... What does he get from this? I don't have that answer yet, but my operating theory is that Ferrara has a relationship with Mercer that predates his position in Castellano's organization, possibly significantly, the kind of relationship that is, by definition, not in any file. He paused. Men like that, men who maintain dual loyalties over years, they usually have a reason that is specific and personal. Money is the most common reason. Serena turned from the window. Or fear. Also possible. She picked up her phone. She stared at the screen. Dominic had given her Marcus's number, and Marcus had given her his, and she had both numbers, and she could call either of them right now and tell them what she knew, and Nico would know within the hour. She put the phone back down. I need you to do something, she said. Weir waited. The federal chain, the financial chain you built, the wire transfers, the intermediary accounts, how complete is it? Complete enough to open a federal investigation. Whether it's complete enough to convict depends on what a prosecutor wants to do with it. Who do you give it to start the federal process? Weir looked at her with a sharpened attention. There's an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District who has been building a financial crimes portfolio that overlaps with Mercer's industry sector. She's been looking for an entryway for 2 years. He paused. I know her, professionally. Could you get the file to her directly, without going through Dominic, without going through anyone? Yes. And if Mercer finds out, he will find out. These things don't stay quiet once they reach a federal desk. He'll know within 48 to 72 hours. That's fine. She looked at the folder. 40-something pages of her own history. I want him to know. I want him to know it's already done before he can do anything about it. Weir studied her for a moment. You understand that this puts you in a different position than simply being Castellano's recovered daughter. If you initiate the federal contact, if you're the one who moves the file, you become a material witness, potentially the primary witness. I know. Your safety protocols become federal, not... I know. She looked at him. How fast can you get it there? I can have it on her desk by this afternoon. Do it. Weir nodded once. He reached for the nearest laptop and began to type. Serena stood at the window and watched him and felt the thing that was happening in her chest. Not fear exactly, and not anger, though it had elements of both. It was something more structural. The sensation of deciding who you were going to be in the specific moment when not deciding was no longer a viable option. She had been invisible for 22 years. She had moved through rooms and been looked through and carried trays and cleaned rooms and been laughed at in front of 800 people, and not one person in all of that had known, had even considered, that she was the missing thread in a 21-year-old crime, that her unremarkable life had been constructed deliberately by people who needed her to be unremarkable. She was done being unremarkable. She picked up her phone again. This time she called the number Marcus had given her. He answered on the first ring. Miss Vale, I need to see Dominic in person today, but not at the Caldwell building. A pause. I can arrange that. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere Nico doesn't know about. Another pause. Longer. She could hear Marcus processing the implication of that in the quality of his silence. Understood, he said finally. Give me an hour. She hung up. She looked at Weir, who was still typing, his face lit by the laptop screen in the gray morning light. The files she gets, the AUSA, it includes the server breach? The unauthorized access attempt? It will now, he said, without looking up. And the phone record. The call to Nico. Yes. Good. She sat back down and picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway because her body needed something, and it was there. She looked at the whiteboard, at the red string, at her own photograph, the one where she was walking out of the Blackwood Grand not knowing she was being watched. She thought about Nico sitting at that kitchen table, the assessment look, the way he'd glanced away when she held his eyes. She had read that as a small victory, a point scored. She had been reading the wrong thing. She had been sitting 6 feet from the man who had tried to have her taken. And she had been proud of herself for making him look away. And she had not understood that he was not threatened by her. He was measuring her. He was deciding whether she was enough of a problem to accelerate the timeline. The timeline she had apparently just accelerated herself. Her phone buzzed. Marcus. Location set. 11 a.m. I'll send the address at 10:45. Come alone. She read it twice. Then a second text from the same number, 4 minutes later. One more thing. Mr. Castellano asked me to tell you, Nico left the building at 7 a.m. He said he had a meeting. He hasn't checked in since. Serena looked at that text for a long time. Nico was in the wind, which meant he knew that she knew, or suspected that she suspected, or had been tipped by Mercer, by someone watching Weir's building, by some thread in the network that she couldn't see the shape of, that the timeline had shifted, which meant that whatever was going to happen next was already in motion. She looked at Weir. Someone might be watching this building. He didn't stop typing. I know. I've been watching the street since 4 a.m. There's a gray sedan that's been parked across from the bakery since before you arrived. Engine off, driver visible. He paused. I made a call while you were reading. There's a car coming for me in 20 minutes. I won't be here when the sedan decides to move. And me? The back exit of this building opens onto a narrow alley that connects to the next block. Your phone's GPS. She had already turned it off. She showed him the dark screen. He looked at her with something that was almost approval. There's a transit hub 2 blocks east. From there you can reach Penn Station in 12 minutes. He finally looked up from the laptop. The file is sent. It's already moving. Serena picked up her bag. She thought about 22 years of being precisely where someone else had decided she should be. A specific neighborhood, a specific school, a specific trajectory through an unremarkable life. All of it constructed by the calculations of a man she had only last night found a face for. She thought about Nico somewhere in this city, making his own calls, running his own calculations. She thought about Dominic in an apartment she was never going back to, not knowing yet that the man who had run his operations for 11 years had been... Serena moved through the alley at a pace that was not quite running because running drew attention, and she had learned in the last 14 hours that attention was a form of exposure she could no longer afford. The alley was narrow and smelled like standing water, and the particular sourness of commercial garbage, and her shoes were not made for uneven ground, but she moved anyway, one hand trailing the brick wall on her left for orientation in the gray morning shadow. Behind her, she could hear nothing from the building she'd left, which either meant Weir had gotten out clean or meant the sedan across the street had not yet moved. And she did not have the information to know which was true, so she kept moving and filed the not knowing alongside everything else she was currently carrying. The transit hub was where Weir had said it would be. 2 blocks east, a glass and steel structure that was already filling with the morning commute, bodies moving in all directions, the specific compressed energy of people who needed to be somewhere and were calculating whether they would make it. Serena pulled her collar up and kept her head at the angle of someone looking at their phone, which she was not, because her phone was still dark, GPS still off. She bought a ticket with cash from the machine. One of Diane's 20s pressed flat in the inside pocket of her bag. She had $47 in cash total. She thought about that for exactly the duration of the transaction and then stopped thinking about it because it was not the most pressing problem. Penn Station in 11 minutes. Then she had 40 minutes until Marcus sent the address. She stood on the platform and watched the tunnel and thought about Nico. 11 years. That was the number Dominic had used. The particular emphasis of a man measuring loyalty and time, because time was the only currency of that kind of trust that felt real. 11 years of proximity, 11 years of access, 11 years of knowing the structure, the personnel, the vulnerabilities, the pressure points. All of it fed, in portions and over time, to a man who had spent those same 11 years building a financial empire on the foundation of a crime that had never been prosecuted. She thought about how you do that, how you sit across from someone for 11 years and eat their food and carry their confidence and look them in the eye and maintain the face of a man who is exactly where he appears to be. She tried to construct it psychologically and kept failing, kept hitting a wall where her imagination refused to supply the internal architecture required. Either Nico had never had the capacity for genuine loyalty and had simply been very good at performing it, or he'd had it once and had it eroded by money, by fear, by something Mercer held over him that had been sufficient to hollow out 11 years of the other thing. She didn't know which was worse. The train came. She got off at Penn Station at 7:52 and went to a coffee counter and bought the cheapest thing on the menu and sat at a high table against the wall and watched the main hall and waited. At 10:43, Marcus's message came through. An address in Red Hook, Brooklyn. A warehouse space on a street that ran along the water. She looked at it for a long moment, then she turned her phone back off and hailed a cab with her last $12 of the 47. The cab dropped her on a street that was mostly industrial. Low buildings, loading bays, the smell of the harbor. The address was a building that looked disused from the outside, but had a car parked at its side door that she recognized as the black SUV from the night before. Marcus was standing at the door. He looked at her with the particular attentiveness of a man who had been told something since the last time he'd seen her and was now recalibrating. "He's inside," Marcus said. "Is Nico here?" "No." She went in. The interior of the building was a single large space that had once been used for something industrial. High ceiling, concrete floor, the ghost of old equipment in the patterns of wear on the ground. Someone had set up a table and 4 chairs near the center, under a work light that had been rigged to a generator. The generator was running at a low hum. Dominic was standing at the far end of the space, his back to her, looking at the water through a gap in the wall where a loading door had been left open 6 inches. He was in different clothes than last night. Dark jacket, dark pants, no tie. He looked, in the industrial light, less like the man who had commanded a ballroom, and more like the thing beneath that. Whatever had been required of him before he'd had a ballroom to command. He heard her come in and turned. She had prepared several openings on the cab ride over. She had prepared the factual sequence, Weir's file, the phone record, the server access, the money chain, the AUSA, the file already sent. She had prepared it as a sequence because sequences were manageable and because she needed this to move fast and she didn't have the bandwidth for the version of this conversation that lingered. What she had not prepared for was the look on his face. He already knew. Not everything, but enough. She could see it. The specific quality of a man who has received information that has reorganized something fundamental and who is in the process of deciding what he's going to do about the reorganization. "Marcus told you," she said. "Marcus told me you asked to meet somewhere Nico didn't know about." He paused. That was sufficient. "You knew before Marcus told you." A long pause. "I had a suspicion. For about 6 weeks. Something in the timing of certain moves that Mercer made, things he shouldn't have known." He looked at her directly. "I didn't let myself believe it. Because 11 years. Yes." Serena set her bag down on the table. She pulled out the folder. Weir's full file, which she'd taken with her from Hoboken. She set it on the table between them. "Page 31, she said. "The phone record, and the server breach log." He picked it up. He read it with the stillness of a man who had taught himself to receive bad information without visible reaction, and she watched his face anyway because she was looking for the thing underneath the stillness. It was there. Small, but there. Something that moved through his jaw and his eyes in the specific way of a man absorbing the confirmation of a thing he had hoped was wrong. He set the folder down. "The federal file," he said. "It's already at the AUSA. Since this morning, it's moving." He nodded. One slow movement. "You did that without telling me." "Yes." "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because the only person in your organization who knew about the investigation was Nico. And if I'd told you first, Nico would have known within the hour." He accepted that. She watched him accept it. The particular motion of a man letting something land rather than deflecting it. "Mercer knows the file is moving," he said. "He'll know by tonight. We're estimated 48 hours before it reaches actionable status at the federal level, which gives Mercer a window." She paused. "Where's Nico?" "We don't know." "And Mercer?" "His building, Midtown. He went in at 8 a.m. and hasn't come out." Dominic looked at her. That's unusual for him. He has a meeting schedule that doesn't vary. He cancels everything this morning and stays inside. That's a man who's managing something. He's going to run, Serena said. He can't run. He has 48 hours before the federal net closes. If he runs before the charges are formal, he accelerates the timeline on himself. He has to know that. Then he's going to do something else. The word something hung in the air of the warehouse, and they both understood what it meant in the shape of this situation, even without naming it. Serena thought about the 4 men in catering uniforms. She thought about the gray sedan outside Weir's building in Hoboken. She thought about the way Mercer had looked in that photograph from the gala, watching her from across the room all night, watching with the careful attention of a man making calculations about a variable he hadn't accounted for. A door at the far end of the warehouse opened. It was not Marcus. It was a man Serena hadn't seen before, younger, with the contained alertness of someone who had been outside and was now delivering information. He crossed to Dominic and said something close to his ear. Dominic's face changed. "Where?" he said. The man said something else, short. Dominic looked at Serena. "Nico just walked into Mercer's building," he said. The temperature in the room dropped, not literally, but the quality of the air changed, the way air changes when the thing you've been half expecting arrives and confirms itself. Serena said, "Weir." She was already reaching for her bag. Her phone was off. She turned it on, and while it was powering up, she was moving, crossing to the table, picking up the folder, doing the arithmetic in her head. Weir had left Hoboken at 7-something. He'd said 20 minutes for his car. He had the original files, the local copies, the things he didn't send to the AUSA, because a first contact file is curated and complete files are leverage. If Nico had given Mercer the address, her phone came on. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. She called it back. It rang 4 times. 5. 6. On the 7th ring, a voice she didn't recognize. Male, young, tense. "Who is this?" "I'm looking for Carson Weir." A pause that lasted too long. "Mr. Weir is... He can't come to the phone right now." "Who are you?" I work with him. He asked me to..." The voice broke slightly, recollected itself. "He's at St. Luke's, Roosevelt campus. There was an incident. He's asking for you." Serena looked at Dominic. He was already moving. They took the SUV north and crossed back into Manhattan over the Brooklyn Bridge. And the city outside the windows was doing its ordinary morning thing. Cabs, pedestrians, the mechanical indifference of a place that didn't stop for individual disasters. And Serena sat in the back with her bag in her lap and her hands very still, and thought about what an incident meant in the language of a young man trying not to say something directly. St. Luke's was on 114th and Amsterdam. They were there in 18 minutes. Marcus dropped them at the ER entrance, and they went through the automatic doors into the particular controlled chaos of a hospital emergency department, the smell of antiseptic and unwashed air, the noise of multiple distresses happening at different volumes. Weir was in a curtained bay in the trauma area. One of his arms was in a temporary splint, and there was a dressing above his left eyebrow, and his face had the grayish, deflated quality of someone who had been hit and was in the aftermath of adrenaline leaving a body. The young man from the phone was sitting in the corner, late 20s, dark jacket, the white face of someone who had witnessed something they hadn't been prepared for. Weir looked at Serena when she came through the curtain, and something in him seemed to adjust, like a reading settling. "The copies," she said. "Safe." His voice was thin but steady. "Different location. Mercer's people hit the Hoboken rental 20 minutes after my car picked me up. They were thorough." He paused. "They were also 11 minutes too late." "Who was in the rental?" "No one. I had the building manager there for a handoff. He's fine. He was in the front room. They came through the back." He shifted slightly and his face tightened and then settled. "They took the hardware, the laptops, the printer, the external drives, everything on the whiteboard. But not the copies." "No." "Where are the copies?" He looked at her for a moment, then at Dominic, then back at her. "With the AUSA, all of it, full file, supplementary documents, the server breach log, the phone record. I sent the complete package at 6:15 this morning. He paused. I was more thorough than I told you. The Dominic, who had been standing just inside the curtain, said, the hardware they took, can they use it? Encrypted drives. Everything above draft level. Weir looked at him. They got the whiteboard, the visual layout, names, connections, dates, the red string. He paused. They know the shape of what we built. They just don't have the documents themselves. Nico knew the shape anyway, Dominic said. Yes. A silence in the small bay. The sounds of the ER continued around them, indifferent. A monitor beeping in the next space, voices at the nursing station, someone in pain somewhere to the left. Serena said, Mercer knows the documents are at the federal desk. He knows by now, yes. And he knows he can't get them back. No. So he has one move left. She looked at Dominic. He needs to discredit the chain, the DNA chain specifically. If he can make the paternal sample inadmissible, if he can raise questions about how the investigation was conducted, who authorized it, whether it was legally obtained, he can't get a federal DNA result thrown out, Dominic said. He can try. With the right lawyers and the right amount of money, he can create enough procedural noise to delay the federal timeline by months. Maybe more. She looked at Weir. Is there anything in the sample acquisition that's procedurally weak? Weir was quiet for a moment. The subject sample, he said. Your sample. It was acquired without your knowledge or consent. That's a vulnerability. It's been cross-referenced twice since, which reinforces the result. But the initial acquisition, I'll consent, Serena said. Now, today, formally, I'll provide a new sample directly to the federal lab. Both men looked at her. I'll walk into whatever federal building needs me to walk into, and I will provide a consented sample directly into their chain of custody, she said. That closes the procedural gap. Weir looked at Dominic. Dominic was looking at Serena with the expression she had started to recognize as his version of being surprised. Not the surface of surprise, but the thing underneath it, the recalibration. That puts you in the federal system, he said. Formally, publicly. I know. It's a target. I know. She held his eyes. But it's also the thing that makes Mercer's lawyer strategy pointless. If I provide consent today, there's no procedural argument. The chain is clean. She paused. He loses his last move. A long silence. Weir was the one who broke it. I can call the AUSA directly. Set up the sampling today if she's willing to move fast. Call her, Serena said. Weir reached for his phone with his good hand. Dominic stepped out through the curtain to give him space, and Serena followed. They stood in the corridor between curtained bays, the hospital noise around them, and Dominic looked at her with that same complicated thing in his face that she had been cataloging since the night before. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. You could have walked away last night. You could have gone to Queens and… No, she said. I couldn't. Why? She thought about the honest answer. She had several available to her. The legal one, the strategic one, the one about Carol Vale, and the $40,000 that came from Julian Mercer, and what it meant that her entire childhood had been funded by the man who had arranged her theft. She could give him any of those. She gave him the real one. Because he picked me, she said. Mercer. He looked at a 3-day-old infant and decided she was useful. And then he spent 21 years deciding where I lived and what I knew and who I was allowed to be. Her voice was even, but the thing behind it wasn't. I'm not walking away from that. I'm not going to be what he needs me to be one more day. Dominic said nothing. And also, she said, because you spent 21 years. She stopped. The words were difficult in a way she hadn't expected. I don't know what you are to me yet. I can't. That's going to take time, but you spent 21 years, and the least I can do is not let the man who stole them walk away clean. She watched something move through his face, something that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. Okay, he said. Just that. Quietly. Weir's voice came through the curtain. She'll do it. 2 p.m., Federal Plaza. Serena looked at her watch. 11:23, 2 hours and 37 minutes. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She picked up. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she had never heard before but that she identified immediately, with a cold precision, from the photograph and the news articles and the months of reading she had now done about who this man was and how he spoke and how he moved and what he'd built. Julian Mercer said, "Miss Vale, I think we should talk." Her hand tightened on the phone. She looked at Dominic. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," she said. "I think you'll find that we do." His voice was smooth in the way that things are smooth when enormous effort has been applied to their surface. "The federal file your investigator sent this morning is incomplete. There are things the AUSA doesn't have, things that change the picture considerably, things that concern you specifically." A pause. "Meet me. 1 hour. I'll send the location." Another pause, and the smoothness cracked by exactly 1 millimeter. "Come alone, or I send what I have to every media contact I own. And by 2 p.m., the story isn't Mercer Capital's crimes. It's Dominic Castellano's daughter walking into a federal building to testify against a man whose organization has its own considerable federal history. Is that the story you want breaking while you're in the building?" Serena breathed. She breathed very carefully, in and out, and she looked at Dominic, who could hear none of this and who was watching her face with the focused attention of a man reading weather. "Send the location," she said. She hung up. Dominic said, "Who was that?" She looked at him. She looked at the hospital corridor around them. The nurses, the patients, the relentless, ordinary machinery of a place built for crisis. "Mercer," she said. "He wants to meet. 1 hour." The quality of Dominic's stillness changed. No. He has something. He's running a play. He has nothing. He might. And if he does, if there's something in his hands that he can use to make the story about you instead of him, and he releases it while I'm at Federal Plaza. She looked at him. "I have to know what it is. You're not going alone." He said, "I don't care what he said." His voice had dropped to something that was very quiet and very certain. "You're not meeting Julian Mercer alone. That's not a negotiation." She looked at him. She thought about 22 years of being precisely where someone else had put her, and she thought about what it meant to be in a hospital corridor with a man who had just told her what she was not going to do. And she thought about the 4 men in the Blackwood Grand Corridor last night, and the gray sedan in Hoboken, and Weir's broken arm in the bay behind them. And she thought about the specific difference between being controlled by someone who wanted to use you and being protected by someone who was afraid to lose you again. She said, "You stay back, out of sight. If he sees you, I know how to be invisible." "That's my thing," she said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but the nearest thing to one she'd seen from him. The location arrived on her phone. A parking structure in Chelsea. Level 4, 12:40 p.m., 42 minutes. Serena looked at the address and felt her pulse in her throat and her wrists and the backs of her knees. And she thought about what a man who had just watched 21 years of careful construction begin to come apart would be willing to do in a concrete parking structure with no witnesses and 48 hours before. The parking structure in Chelsea smelled like motor oil and the particular cold of concrete that never got warm regardless of the season. Serena took the stairwell to level 4 because the elevator felt like a trap. One exit, no visibility, the kind of space that a man with resources and desperation could control too easily. The stairwell was open at each landing, and she could hear her own footsteps and the distant traffic noise bleeding in from the street, and she counted the flights and kept her breathing deliberate and thought about nothing except the next step and the one after that. Level 4 was mostly empty. A Tuesday morning, commercial district, most of the spaces vacant until the lunch crowd. The ceiling was low, 7 feet, maybe less, and the support columns threw long shadows under the fluorescent strips, half of which were flickering or dead. The smell of exhaust was thinner up here, replaced by something colder. Harbor air, maybe, finding its way through the open sides of the structure. She saw Mercer before he saw her. He was standing near the far wall by the railing that looked out over the street below. He was in a dark overcoat, no tie, and he looked like a man who had removed the costume of himself and was standing in whatever was underneath it. 51 years old, and the smooth surface from the photographs was gone. Not entirely, because some things were too deeply practiced to fully drop, but eroded enough that she could see the thing beneath it. A man who had been managing a secret for 21 years and had watched the management structure collapse in the span of 14 hours. He turned when she was 20 feet away. His eyes went to her face and stayed there with the particular focus of a man assessing threat, and she held his gaze and kept walking and stopped at 10 feet because 10 feet was close enough to talk and far enough to have options. "You came alone," he said. "I'm here," she said. "Talk." He studied her for a moment. She watched him do it and made herself still, the kind of still she had learned on the floor of the Blackwood Grand when 800 people were laughing at her, and she had needed to be something that couldn't be broken in public. "You're more like him than I expected," Mercer said. "Don't." He accepted the boundary, reached into his coat and produced a manila envelope, letter-sized, sealed. He held it, but didn't offer it yet. "What's in the envelope?" she said. "Documentation." He paused. "Your father's organization has been under federal investigation for money laundering and racketeering since 2019. It's a sealed investigation. The AUSA handling your file doesn't know about it because it's in a different division, different U.S. Attorney's Office, different district." He held her eyes. "If the DNA confirmation goes forward today, if you walk into Federal Plaza and formalize your relationship to Dominic Castellano on the federal record, you become the documented daughter of a man who is already the subject of an active federal investigation. Everything you say, everything you testify to, becomes potentially tainted. Defense lawyers will spend the next 3 years arguing that your testimony was coordinated as part of an organized crime strategy to eliminate a business competitor." Serena said nothing. "The case against me falls apart," Mercer continued, "not because the evidence isn't real, because the witness is compromised, because your father is who he is and you are now, on paper, part of that." He paused. "Walk away today. Don't go to Federal Plaza. Let the file sit. It'll be contested. It'll take years, and without your testimony and the consented DNA, it won't be enough. I'll be gone, somewhere without an extradition treaty. You'll have your life back." Serena looked at him. She looked at the envelope. She thought about what he'd said, and she examined it the way Weir had taught her, in the 6 hours of reading his file to examine a document, not for what it claimed, but for what it was actually doing. "You're scared," she said. He didn't flinch, but something in him compressed. "I'm being practical." "No, you're scared." She took one step forward. "Because if what you're describing were actually fatal to the case, you wouldn't be here. You'd have sent it to a lawyer. You'd have filed a motion. You wouldn't be standing in a parking structure at 12:40 p.m. trying to make a deal with a maid." Something moved across his face. "The federal investigation into Castellano's organization," she said. "It's real. I believe you. And it might complicate things. It might make the next 2 years harder than I want them to be." She paused. "But you know what it doesn't do? It doesn't put you in the building the night my mother was taken from a hospital. It doesn't take your name off the Northgate consulting wire transfers. It doesn't undo the financial chain that Weir built, and it doesn't make the 4 men in the Blackwood Grand corridor last night not exist." She took another step. 8 feet now. "You have one card, and it's not the card you think it is." Mercer was very still. "What do you want?" he said. His voice had changed. The smoothness was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not ugly, exactly. It was just bare. The voice of a man who had run out of performance. "Nothing from you," she said. "I want nothing from you." She turned. She heard him move behind her. Not toward her, but the shift of a man who has realized the conversation has ended and that its ending is not the ending he needed. She heard him say something, but she was already walking, already counting the columns between herself and the stairwell door, already managing her breathing because her hands were shaking, and she needed them not to be. Not until she was through the door and down the stairs and out. She was 2 steps from the door when a figure came through it. Not Dominic, not Marcus. Nico. He looked worse than she'd last seen him. His face had the compressed, used-up quality of a man who had been running his own calculations all morning and had arrived at a conclusion that cost him something. He was in the same clothes as last night. He was looking at her, and then past her at Mercer, and then back at her, and in his eyes was something she hadn't expected. Not aggression, not the cold assessment from the kitchen table. Something closer to cornered. "It's done," he said. Not to her, to Mercer. Mercer said, "What do you mean, done?" The AUSA has been in contact with the Organized Crime Division for the past hour. They're combining the files. Nico's voice was flat, exhausted. Your sealed investigation isn't sealed anymore. It's been folded into the kidnapping case, and it's going federal on both ends simultaneously. He paused. Weir's a USA made a call this morning. Someone in the 2nd Division owed her. He looked at Serena. You knew. I didn't know, she said. But Weir's thorough. Nico looked at her for a long moment. And the thing in his face that she had been trying to read since the kitchen table in the 42nd floor apartment, that quality of assessment, that careful distance, she understood it now. It wasn't the look of a man who didn't feel anything. It was the look of a man who felt things that he had learned over a long time and under a specific kind of pressure to perform the absence of. He's in the building, Nico said. To her, quietly. I know. He's going to... When he comes through that door, I know. She heard the other stairwell door open. The one at the far end of the structure, near the railing where Mercer had been standing. She turned. Dominic came through it with Marcus 3 paces behind him, and 2 other men she didn't know flanking wide. He was moving at the same pace he had crossed the ballroom at. Not fast, not slow, the pace of complete and total intention. He saw Nico. The 2 men looked at each other across the concrete space of level 4, and Serena watched it happen and did not look away because she understood that this was a moment that needed witnesses and that she was the only one present who was not already inside it. Dominic stopped 6 feet from Nico. The other men stopped behind him. Nico didn't move. He didn't reach for anything. He stood with his hands at his sides, and she thought he was going to say something that was calculated, something that was still trying to manage the situation. And instead what came out of him was something that sounded almost involuntary. He had my brother, Nico said. The words landed in the concrete space without echo. What? Dominic said. 2018. My brother was running product independently. Mercer found out. He should have... Nico stopped, started again. His voice was controlled, but it was the control of something being held shut from the inside. Mercer said he'd turn him over. Federal case, 15 to 20. Everything my brother had built. Unless I... He stopped again. It was supposed to be information only. Operational details. Nothing structural. That's how it started. Dominic said nothing. It didn't stay that way, Nico said. These things don't stay that way. Another long silence. Mercer had moved to the edge of the space near the railing, and Marcus had moved to a position that made the railing the less attractive option. And Mercer seemed to understand this with the particular reading of a man who had spent his career assessing rooms. Your brother, Dominic said. Is he? He's fine. He's been fine for 2 years. Mercer kept him as... Nico's jaw tightened. Insurance. Renewed the arrangement every 6 months. And you didn't come to me? No. Why? Nico looked at him, and for the first time since Serena had seen him, the assessment quality was entirely gone from his face. What was there instead was something simpler and more devastating. Because I was ashamed, he said, and because by the time I understood what I'd become, there was too much of it, too many things passed, too many lines. He paused. I thought I could manage it down, keep it contained, get my brother clear, and... He stopped. She found it, he said, not looking at Dominic now, looking at Serena. She found the phone record, and she moved before I could. I couldn't get ahead of it. Serena said, Your brother is clear now. The arrangement doesn't exist anymore. Mercer doesn't have anything to hold. Nico looked at her. The moment the federal case is formalized, which happened this morning, Mercer's leverage over anyone disappears. He's not in a position to threaten anyone. He's in a position of being arrested. She paused. Your brother is fine. Something in Nico's face moved. It was not relief exactly. It was more like the aftermath of relief. What a body does when a thing that has been held at maximum tension is finally allowed to release. His shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. His breathing changed. He looked at Dominic. I'm sorry, he said. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. His face was doing the thing it did. The the complicated interior work, visible only in fragments. He looked at the man who had been with him for 11 years, and he looked at the version of that man that was standing here now, and Serena watched him do it and understood that this was a kind of accounting that had no clean result, that some debts could not be made simple. "You should have come to me," Dominic said. His voice was very quiet. "In 2018, you should have come to me." "I know. I would have. I know." Nico's voice broke on the second word, just slightly. He held it. "I know." At the far end of the space, near the railing, Julian Mercer had been listening to all of this with the expression of a man who is watching the architecture of his safety collapse around him in real time. He was very still. He had the manila envelope in his hand still. He looked now at nothing in particular, not at Serena, not at Dominic, not at Nico. He looked at the middle distance with the blank quality of a man processing an arithmetic that keeps arriving at the same wrong answer. Then he turned to the railing. Marcus moved first, and he moved fast, crossing the 15 feet between them in a time that shouldn't have been possible, getting a hand on Mercer's arm before whatever Mercer had been considering became an action. Mercer didn't fight it. He just went still, and Marcus had his arm, and it was done. The envelope fell from Mercer's hand and landed on the concrete floor, and Serena picked it up and opened it and looked at what was inside. The documentation Mercer had described, the sealed investigation, the case numbers, the legal summary. Real. All of it real. She held it for a moment. Then she handed it to Dominic. "Your lawyer needs to see this," she said. "Today." He took it without looking at it. He was looking at her. "Are you all right?" "Yes." "He didn't. He talked," she said. "That's all he did." 3 floors below, a car horn sounded from the street. Somewhere in the structure, a pigeon moved between columns with the domestic indifference of urban wildlife. The fluorescent strip above them flickered twice and held. Federal agents arrived at 12:58. Not dramatically. That was the thing she remembered later. Not the way it happened in films with shouting and running. 2 unmarked cars pulled into the structure, and 4 agents in plain clothes came up the stairs, and one of them produced credentials and said Julian Mercer's name in the tone of a question that was not a question, and Mercer said yes in a voice that was barely audible, and that was it. He was walked to the stairs without handcuffs. Those came later, downstairs, away from the open sides of the structure, and as he passed her, he stopped. The agent with him allowed it. Mercer looked at Serena for 3 full seconds. She had expected something from that look. Hatred, maybe, or the cold calculation of a man already planning his legal strategy, or even a remnant of the smoothness from the photographs. Some performance of dignity and defeat. Instead, what she saw was something older and stranger. The look of a man confronting a consequence that had taken 21 years to arrive, and that had the particular weight of things that have been deferred too long. He didn't say anything. He walked to the stairs, and then he was gone. The weeks that followed had a quality that Serena struggled to name. Not peace, exactly. Peace implied a before state that she could point to, some prior equilibrium, and there wasn't one. Her life before the Blackwood Grand had not been peaceful. It had been managed. She had been managing it. 3 jobs, 1 letter from a collection agency, the careful mathematics of surviving on the wrong side of the city's wealth distribution, and what the weeks after felt like was not a return to that management, but the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. The federal case moved fast. Faster than cases usually moved, which Weir attributed to the combining of the 2 investigations. The Organized Crime Division and the AUSA's financial crimes work had been circling overlapping territory for years, and the merger gave both of them something they'd been missing. Mercer's legal team filed the expected motions. The consented DNA sample, which Serena had provided at Federal Plaza at 2 p.m., 40 minutes after the parking structure, her arm still adrenaline shaky, but her signature legible, closed the procedural argument before it could fully open. She testified in a preliminary hearing 6 weeks after the gala. She sat in a federal building on a Wednesday morning and answered questions about what she knew and when she knew it and how she knew it, and she did not look at Mercer across the room more than once, and the once was enough. He was in a suit again. The smooth surface had partially reconstructed itself, because men like him knew how to reassemble their surfaces for rooms that required it. But she had seen what was underneath it in a parking structure in Chelsea, and surfaces meant something different to her now. Nico Ferrara cooperated with federal investigators. The cooperation was extensive, 11 years of operational knowledge in an organization that the government had been trying to map for years. His testimony formed the backbone of a case that was, in certain federal offices, referred to as unprecedented in scope. The charges against him were substantial, but the cooperation credit was substantial also, and his brother, whose name was Marco, who was 26 years old and who Serena would never meet but whose existence had cost 11 years of Nico's life, so was not charged. Dominic's organization was the complicated part. The organized crime investigation did not disappear with Mercer's arrest. It had its own momentum, its own personnel, who had been building it for years, and who did not consider the kidnapping case a reason to abandon their own work. What happened instead, over many months, was a series of negotiations and agreements and legal proceedings that Serena was not party to and did not fully understand. What she understood was that Dominic's lawyers were expensive and experienced, and that the outcome, when it came, was not an acquittal and not a conviction, but something in between, a structured agreement that involved the dismantling of certain specific operations and the survival of the rest, and a man who emerged from the process diminished in certain specific ways and altered in others. She did not know how she felt about that. She sat with the not knowing for a long time and decided that sitting with it was more honest than forcing it into a shape. She quit the Blackwood Grand 4 days after the gala. Not dramatically. She sent an email and returned her uniform. The hotel sent her final paycheck with a note from HR that said nothing of substance. She never went back. She kept the other 2 jobs for another month and then let one go. Then the other. The collection agency letter, when she finally opened it, was for a sum that was significant on her prior income and manageable on the income she had now, which came from a trust that Dominic's lawyers had established with a formality that felt to Serena like an attempt to make a thing legal that could not be made simple. She accepted it with conditions, her conditions, presented in writing, 3 pages, which she had drafted herself at Diane's kitchen table over 2 nights. The conditions were about decision-making and autonomy, and what it meant to be known by someone versus being owned by someone. Dominic's lawyers had sent the conditions to Dominic, and Dominic had signed them without modification. That had told her something. She moved out of the Queen's apartment in March, into a place in Carroll Gardens that had natural light, and a small garden, and a landlord who fixed things when asked, none of which had been true of the previous place. She put Carol Vale's ceramic mug, which had been returned to her without explanation, by a messenger who arrived at Diane's building in January with a padded envelope, on the kitchen counter. The chip in the handle was exactly where it had always been. She and Dominic met for the first time without an agenda on a Saturday in April. Not at the Caldwell building, at a restaurant in the West Village that had been his suggestion and that she had walked past on Google Maps before agreeing to, a corner place, modest size, the kind of restaurant that had been there for 20 years and had earned its regulars. She arrived 7 minutes early and chose a table that could see the door. And when he came in, he saw her immediately, and there was a moment where they both just sat with the fact of each other across a room. Unremarkable, ordinary. 2 people at a restaurant on a Saturday in April. And something in that moment was the first thing in the past 6 months that felt, in some small and imperfect way, like ground. He ordered the same thing she did, which was coincidental, and they both noticed it, and neither of them commented on it. They talked for 3 hours. Not about the case, not about Mercer, or the federal proceedings, or NACO, or any of it. They talked about other things, things she had not expected him to have opinions about, and things she had not expected to find herself saying to a near stranger. And the 3 hours passed the way time passes when you're in a conversation that you're not monitoring because it doesn't require monitoring. When they were leaving, standing on the sidewalk in the particular softness of an April evening, he said, "There are things I should tell you, about your mother, what the investigation found about the year before your placement." She looked at him. "Not tonight." He accepted that. "But eventually," she said. "Yes, eventually." She looked at the street, the ordinary Saturday evening of it, people and dogs and the sound of a place living in its own continuity without particular reference to anyone's private earthquake. "I'm not—" She stopped. Tried again. I don't know how to do this. Whatever this is, I don't have a reference for it. Neither do I, he said. She died before... He stopped. I don't have a reference either. She looked at him, the thing that she had been looking for in his face since the corridor at the Blackwood Grand. The familiar thing, the thing you look for in a stranger's face when a document tells you that stranger is not a stranger. She stopped looking for it consciously, somewhere around the third month. It was there or it wasn't, and the looking for it was its own kind of need that she didn't want to feed. What she found instead, in the restaurant and on the sidewalk, and in the conversations that came after, was something different from resemblance. Something that operated not at the level of features or expressions, but at the level of how a person moved through difficulty. The particular stillness, the preference for the real over the performed, the way he said what he meant and stopped when he'd said it. She recognized those things. Not from him, from herself. The coastal estate was a place she visited for the first time in June, not because he asked, he didn't ask, but because she wanted to see the Atlantic, which she had not seen since a school trip at 14, that she remembered mostly as cold and logistically complicated. The estate was on a stretch of Connecticut coast that was private without being ostentatious, which surprised her. She had been constructing, in the back of her mind, a version of what wealthy men's properties looked like, and the reality was quieter than the construction. The day she came, it was just the two of them and a housekeeper named Elsa who had been there for 23 years, and who looked at Serena with the eyes of a woman who had been waiting for this specific person to arrive and was not going to say that, but wasn't going to pretend otherwise either. They walked to the water in the late afternoon. The beach was rocky. Not the soft sand of postcards, but the kind of beach that requires attention, that asks something of you. She found herself liking that. She found herself liking the way the light came off the water and the way the sound of it filled in all the silence without making it less quiet. Dominic stood beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the water and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "She would have liked you." She understood who he meant. "Tell me about her," Serena said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he began to talk and she listened, and the light moved across the water while he talked, and the sound of the Atlantic filled in around his words, and she stood there and let it happen. Let the story of a woman she had never known come toward her across the water and the years, and she did not try to organize it into something manageable or put it into a frame she already owned. She let it be what it was, which was grief and loss, and the particular kind of love that had survived 21 years of not knowing whether it had anywhere to land. She thought about Carol Vale, the smell of industrial detergent, the ceramic mug, the $20 folded into Christmas cards. You came from somewhere good, baby. She had. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before. Not as a comfortable thing, not as a resolution, but as a true thing. Complicated and costly and real. She had come from somewhere good and had been taken from it, and had landed in something else that was also good, in its own worn and imperfect way. And the distance between those two things was a crime and also a life. And she was, it turned out, the person who had to carry both. She could do that. She looked at the sun going down over the water, the slow, indifferent beauty of it, the way it didn't require anything from anyone, the way it was just doing what it did regardless of what had happened on the land beneath it. Beside her, Dominic had gone quiet. She looked at him. He was looking at the water with the expression of a man who had been waiting a very long time for something and had recently stopped waiting in the way that you stop waiting when the thing has finally arrived. Not with celebration, which is a form of disbelief, but with the quieter and more lasting adjustment of someone who is learning, slowly, what it means to have what they were waiting for. She looked back at the water. Somewhere behind them, the house held its light against the coming dark. Elsa was probably in the kitchen. The beach was empty in both directions as far as she could see. She thought about the Blackwood Grand Ballroom, the weight of a silver tray, the sound of 800 people laughing, the way it had felt to be invisible for 22 years. Not painful exactly, because you adapted to the shape of your life, but limiting in a way that she hadn't had the vocabulary for until she'd stood in a parking structure in Chelsea and told a man who had spent 21 years deciding who she was that she wanted nothing from him. That was the moment she would return to, she thought, in the years ahead. Not the ballroom, not the document, not the federal building or the parking structure or the 3-hour restaurant conversation in April. The moment in the stairwell of the Blackwood Grand, coming down 5 flights in the dark with a crumpled document in her apron pocket and a man behind her who had spent 2 decades looking for her, and the specific quality of her own footsteps on the concrete, certain, forward, hers. The sun finished its descent. The water went dark at the edges and held its light at the center the way water does, longer than you expect. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. They stood there together, in the way of people who are still learning the shape of each other, on a beach that asked something of you, and let the evening come.